Take a look at this image. It looks a little weird, right? But why? What exactly is wrong for this image to look weird? If you want the short answers, vanishing points and proportioning are the two key factors in making or breaking your perspective. If you want the long answer, then in this video, I will be going over why these factors are so important, and then I'll be going over how these factors can be used in your art. In an ideal perspective, all the lines of your objects will converge and meet at a single point. This point is called a vanishing point. I think the confusing part about vanishing points are the lines that come out of it. Why does the perspective suddenly look good when I make the lines go to the point? It almost seems like magic. Well, to understand why they work, I think it's better to think of these lines not as lines, but as planes. It's still a vanishing point, and it's still the same vanishing point. It's just drawn as planes for easier visualization. You can think of planes as imaginary flat sheets, keyword being flat. So when you're aligning the lines of the object you're trying to draw to the vanishing points, what you're really doing is making the sides parallel to the plane, and therefore parallel to the ground. Because of this, it is more accurate to say we are aligning the planes parallel to the ground rather than aligning the lines towards the vanishing point, because that's exactly what you're doing. Although I admit, the second one is less confusing and much easier to understand. Let's look at an example. This is a cube that isn't converging towards a vanishing point. You can see how it looks a little out of place, and the reason for that is because it doesn't look like it's on the ground. At least, not flat on the ground. When we align the faces along the planes, the cube now looks like it's on the ground. The bottom cube now looks like it's in perspective. If only the bottom is converging towards the vanishing point, it means the bottom is flat on the ground. If only the top is converging towards the vanishing point, it means the top is parallel to the ground. A quick aside, these quote-unquote lines, or more accurately, these planes, are what's called a perspective grid. Basically, perspective grids and vanishing points are tools that will help you level your objects to make them appear like they're on the ground. That's also the reason why you don't really see artists try to make characters fit the perspective grid if they're doing a dynamic pose. Now that we went through why vanishing points work, let's talk more about the advanced parts about them. There are many types of perspectives that can be made with these vanishing points. You have 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, and 3-point perspective. There are also 4, 5, and 6-point perspective, which gets trippier as it increases, so for now, let's just focus on 1, 2, and 3. With these types of perspectives, drawing in a horizon line will help. The horizon line, or more accurately like we talked about earlier, the horizon plane, is also known as the eye level. This line is where all the planes converge as they travel off into the distance. When you're placing the vanishing points, the first two are always on the horizon line. After all, vanishing points are points where all the planes converge as we discussed earlier, so it makes sense for the points to always be on the horizon. If you're doing 1-point perspective, the vanishing point is typically mostly always in the middle. If you're doing 2-point perspective, just put the 2 points anywhere on the horizon. The further out or closer they are, the more distorted they become. With 3-point perspective, you're going to want to add a point at the top or at the bottom of the horizon line, so that way, the planes now converge at the top or on the bottom. In 1-point and 2-point, the vertical planes didn't converge. With 4, 5, 6, etc., you're just distorting the scale of the planes. So for example, 4-point perspective is just 1-point perspective, but you make it wider in the middle and more distorted. As you can see here, I just used the liquefy tool to transform 1 point to 4 points. One last thing I want to mention with perspective grids is that it's not enough to just align your lines along the perspective grids created by the vanishing points. As you can see here, the lines of the car are aligned perfectly, but the car feels sort of off. It's like the car is almost floating or something. We need a way to make them appear like they're on the same level, and there's an easy way to do this. Anything above the horizon line will stay above the horizon line, if it's on the same level. Going back to the image I showed earlier, we can now fix the plane that the car is in by adjusting it to the correct level. In this case, anything above the metal grate of the car is above the horizon line. So to make sure the other car is on the same level, we will do the same for that. And voila, they are on the same ground. This is technically linear perspective, which I will go over more in detail later in the video, but it's also related to perspective grids, so I thought I'd quickly go over it here as well. Hello. That was quite the beating we just went through in the explanation section, but don't worry, the practice section is shorter. To use perspective grids / vanishing points, just make the lines go towards them. That's pretty much it. Basically, just make the lines go to the points. Now this is simple enough for objects with straight edges, but what about objects that don't have straight lines or are organic shapes? Like the cylinder, for example. It's quite simple actually. Just draw a box surrounding the object and then align the box along with the lines. This is because a box has planes that are easier for us to draw and to align towards the planes towards the points. My circles are a little wonky, but you get my point. You can also do this for circles. If you want to draw those in perspective, use a square instead of a box. Also, if you don't like how these point perspectives make everything look unnaturally organized, this same technique is also quite useful for drawing objects that are rotated. Because remember, the only reason we use vanishing points is to align the planes of an object so that it looks flat. So you can use this technique so long as the feet of the object are flat on the ground. When it comes to actually practicing the point perspectives, use boxes to practice. And also keep in mind that the lines from the vanishing points are more spaced apart as they get closer to the camera. Trust me, once you're good with boxes in perspective, you'll be good with anything. Don't worry about proportioning for now, so if you're drawing boxes that look too long or wonky, it's fine. As long as you're practicing how to use the grids. There are two types of proportioning when we're dealing with perspective: angular proportioning and linear proportioning. Angular proportioning is when we need to proportion the size of an object when it's at an angle. Obviously, the size of a cube isn't going to be the same as the front of the cube, so we need to figure out a way to solve that. Linear proportioning is proportioning when you have objects that extend into the background. We are going to need to proportion objects in the background such that it looks convincing in the distance, as opposed to looking too big when it's supposed to be in the distance. This is just foreshortening, and I've already talked about this in my video about proportioning, but to save you the trouble of having to click off this video, I'll summarize everything for you, but I am going to use the footage from that video though to make things a little easier. Everyone knows the basic idea behind foreshortening, but the problem is that you can mess up foreshortening. Just take this illustration for example. You can tell that this arm is supposed to be at an angle, but it doesn't really seem completely right. That's because the proportions of the arm aren't correct, and if you have the wrong proportions, it can just break the entire perspective. To solve this, we are going to need... I've already done this joke, let's just move on. Basically, if you're rotating an object away from the camera 30 degrees, its length will be 86%. If it's 45 degrees, it's 70%, and if it's 60 degrees, it'll be 50%. If the object is facing the camera more as it turns, it's the opposite. So 30 degrees will be 50%, 45 degrees will be 70%, and 60 degrees will be 86%. Having said all that though, this is a little overkill. Especially if you're going to be drawing a lot of objects in your illustrations, it's a bit much. Instead, save this for when something looks absolutely wrong in perspective, because most of the time, if something looks good enough, it's good enough. If you want a simpler and easier method of dealing with angular proportions, you can draw a box around the object and mark down some points on a box to use as a reference. Then when you're trying to draw the object again in perspective, draw the box first, mark down the same points, and then try to draw the object to fit the markings you just made. The car doesn't have any major angular proportion issues, but this arm from the video I made does. This angle looks like it's 45 degrees, so change the proportions to 70% of the original length of the normal arm, and voila. The classic box turnaround exercise. It's quite simple. Start with a box directly facing at you, and then gradually rotate the box in a particular direction until you get a whole grid. You might have done this before and we're going to be doing it again. This time, however, try to get the proportions of the boxes right. It doesn't need to be perfect, just convincing. And after you're done with your boxes, remember how I said you can draw anything in perspective if you put a box around it? Well, now you have a whole grid, where you can put any object inside to get a feel for how it looks. So this serves as both an exercise and a reference. Now that we know how to deal with proportions when an object is at certain angles, we can then work on perspective of objects when they are in the background. For example, if we have a car in the distance, how can we draw another car right next to us without breaking the perspective? There's a little rule for linear perspective. Let's say you have an object a certain distance away from the camera. If you halve the distance between you and the object, the area of the object will increase by 4 times. If you decrease the distance, the area will decrease by 4 times. If you want other distances between you and the object, use this formula. Just put in however many times the distance you want in here, and whatever number comes out is how big or small you should draw it. I'll admit, this is a lot of math, and realistically, you're not going to be sitting there and calculating everything. Save this technique for when something looks off, but you don't know why it looks off. If something looks good enough, then I don't think it's really worth doing all this math, but it's good to keep in your repertoire. For a more realistic and simpler method, think about how the objects will look next to each other, and then keep that in mind when drawing this time. In this case, the foot and the book should roughly be the same size, so we just need to adjust that accordingly. And finally, as I've mentioned before, anything above the horizon line will stay above the horizon, and the proportions are the same. This rule is only true if the ground is flat. So, if 50% of the body is above the horizon line, then no matter where that person is, this will remain true. Again, so long as the ground is flat. Following this rule will make putting objects in the distance easier and make your perspective consistent, but you can also break this rule if you want to introduce some elevation in your background. Perhaps a person is on a small hill or something like that, for example. One final time, let's go back to the cars and fix it up. And there we go. The distance between the closest car to us would be roughly half the distance from us to the furthest car. So we can just make the area 4 times bigger than the original, and it seems to work fine. Again, you don't need to be super accurate, just convincing enough. If we're practicing the linear perspective thing, one of the methods I used is Google Maps. Just select a spot, street view it, and copy and paste it onto your canvas. After that, try to pick out an object that is already in the photo and draw it again, except this time further away from the camera or closer. You can also draw in other things like people as well. This will help you develop a better understanding of linear perspective. And that's it for linear perspective. And that's also it for perspective. If you got something out of this, or if you didn't get anything out of this, feel free to let me know. If you have any other methods for linear perspective, feel free to let everyone know. Good luck with your art journey, and thank you for watching.